Radhe Radhe. Today is Saturday, 26th November 2022, and Mummy and I are here to present our recap video for today's Bhagavad Gita study session for chapter 6.
Radhe Radhe.
Sharing the screen, we, as always, started out with our few quiz questions to cover the content of the previous class. So that was for chapter 6, verses 24, 25, and 26. We encourage you to go back and look through that material. And then we covered chapter 6, verses 27, 28, and 29. Starting off with chapter 6, verse 27, let's hear the recitation.
Prashantamanasam hvenam yoginam sukham uttamam upaiti shantarajasam brahma bhutam akalmasham.
So chapter 6, verse 27, heartiest happiness is the catchphrase here, referring to, in Sri Krishna's own words in the translation, the transcendental happiness that a yogi seeks to attain. And heartiest here really referring to the fact that God is seated in our hearts. That ultimate bliss emanates from within itself. So looking at the text and the commentary, we saw that great transcendental happiness comes to the yogi who practices certain things. The mind is calm. We saw that through the analogy of the tortoise previously, pratyahar, withdrawing the senses, being equanimous as well. And of course, whose passions are subdued and who is without sin. And finally, we see this many times in today's content, that concept of equal eye. So here, seeing everything in connection with God. So with all these different attributes, along with the quotation we saw from Sage Narad as well, it's really describing the summary that the consciousness of the devotee is such that their mind is united in love with God. And through the practice of meditation, the person always has the mind and thoughts fixed in God alone. And when that absorption continues and with more and more practice, meditation becomes easier, that's when the soul, Swamiji says, begins to experience a glimpse of that infinite bliss, that transcendental, the heartiest happiness, sukham uttamam, that is within itself. It's because God is seated within our hearts. In fact, in the commentary, we also saw a very helpful question and answer related to sadhaks wondering how they are making progress. What is the sign or symptom of that? And truly here we see in Sri Krishna's words that as you can feel more and more of that infinite transcendental bliss from within increasing, that is a sign of spiritual elevation. So again, Shanta Rajasam, being free from passion, Akalmasham, being sinless, Brahma Bhutam, endowed with God realization, all that eventually leads to that highest bliss, Sukham Uttamam. But a final reminder, self-realization can happen with all of our spiritual knowledge and wisdom that we gain along the way with our effort. But God realization, Brahma Bhutam, being endowed with God realization, can only happen through the grace of God. We'll next look at chapter 6, verse 28.
Yunjannevam satatmanam yogi vigata kalmashaha sukhena brahma sansparsham atyantam sukham ashnute.
So here the catchphrase for chapter 6, verse 28 is uncontaminated consciousness, because that truly describes the consciousness of a yogi who has been spiritually elevated through all the practice and connection with God. For us, of course, with the material mind and all the connection in the material world, the consciousness is contaminated, but we try to make small steps to get that less and less contaminated, more and more pure. So again, Sri Krishna says the yogi is self-controlled, uniting the self with God, being free from material contamination, and being in constant touch with the Supreme, again, through the mind being focused upon God. Through all that, one can achieve that highest state of perfect happiness. Here, the other word used is atyantam as a replacement for uttamam, to describe highest. So Sukham Uttamam previously, here we have Sukham Atyantam, Atyantam Sukham. And here we see that there are 4 categories of happiness Swamiji describes to us from the Srimad Bhagavatam. In fact, from the Uddhav Gita portion of the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's the gradually elevating kinds of happiness going from tamasic to rajasic to sattvic and finally nirguna. The first 3 terms we mentioned, most of you are familiar with from earlier in chapter 3 or elsewhere as the 3 modes of material nature, the 3 gunas, tamas, rajas, sattva. Beyond that, we have mentioned several times, God, we seek that yog and we seek to cross over into Shuddha Sattva. So that's sort of the guna for God. And here now we see a 4th kind of happiness. It is nirguna happiness. Nirguna on one hand really meaning without qualities or attributes, but referring to the material sense where there are no good or bad qualities. It is in fact perfection, which only God has. That is why we talk about the infinite bliss and the divinity associated with God, which is nirguna happiness. And again, a reminder to take a look at chapter 5, verse 21, and chapter 6, verse 21 as well. We'll finally see chapter 6, verse 29.
Sarvabhutasthamatmanam Sarvabhutani Chatmani Ikshate Yoga Yuktatma Sarvatra Samadarshanaha.
So chapter 6, verse 29, like a kid in a candy store, the analogy being given in Swamiji's commentary, talking about those molds of candy and sugar sweets from the times of Diwali with different shapes and forms, such as cars, aeroplanes, and other animals. Kids running around and seeking the one of their choice because they think each item is different, and the one that they choose will give them their highest level of happiness. But the reality is that it's all innocuous, it's harmless. Parents realize this, and then eventually devotees, in the spiritual sense, also realize that everything emanates from God Himself. The sweetness level is the same for the candies, the happiness and bliss level is the same for a yogi whose consciousness is united with God. So our goal is to try to understand that just as the sun, although staying in one place, emanates its light everywhere, its brightness and shine on all, likewise God, with the light of realized knowledge and wisdom, God spreads that on all of us. And for us, our goal is to realize that God is seated in each living being, and of course, each living being is a part of God. So as we try to practice more and more of that, even if we are practicing elements of sattvic happiness, being good to others, being kind to them, if we can channel more and more of that in seva and service towards devotion and offerings towards God, that is going to help get us towards a stronger connection with God. Mami, I'll pass it over to you for any important words or other comments.
Yeah, so let's see verse number 27, and important word is prashant. Prashant means peaceful. And how do you become peaceful? When you are able to control your mind. And the yogis are the ones who are able to control their minds by subduing their passions. That is Shant Rajasam. And when they are able to do that, they are akalmasham. That means they are not creating any sins. And that is when then they become Brahma Bhutam. Brahma Bhutam means they get endowed with God realization. Now, verse number 28, a very important word is Yunjan. First is Yunjan. Yunjan means to unite yourself with God. And then how do you unite yourself with God? That is through Brahma Sansparsham. That means being constantly in touch with the Supreme. In every work we do, in our loving devotion, service, we have to learn to be in constant touch with God. Think of God, talk of God, and do everything for God. Then verse number 29, it finally teaches us how to become samdarshanaha. Samdarshanaha means having equal vision. Why equal vision? Because there is sarvabhutastham. Sarvabhutastham means that God is situated in all living beings. So God is in my heart, God is in your heart. And when we understand that, then we start seeing everybody equally. Then we start seeing God in everybody. With those words, I think it helps to explain these verses whereby we start attaching our mind more and more to God, and then we can experience the perfect happiness, that divine bliss. Over to you, Gagan.
Yes, indeed. With more and more practice through meditation as well as other efforts, kirtan, of course, bhakti being very, very important, all that helps us build that connection with God. And to kind of restate again from chapter 6, verse 28, being in constant touch with the Supreme. As we mentioned in class, this touch here, I like the use of it because it's not just through our material senses. The soul is invisible, the Supreme Soul, all that cannot be perceived just by the material senses. It's about being in touch in terms of consciousness, the divinity that emanates from within. That is how we want to increase that connection and that yog with God even more. With that, we look forward to your continued connection with your individual journeys and look forward to meeting next week, hopefully, which is Saturday, 3rd December, 2022. Very special day, Gita Jayanti. We'll keep you all posted through the usual channels about class. Till then, happy learning. Thank you. Radhe Radhe.
Radhe Radhe.